exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Red leader to red 3. You've got company on your 6. This is red 3, leading you round in clear. Fast has got a line on you. Roll out hard.
Wow. Well, man, that red Baron has been on my tail for I don't know how long. I think I finally got him. I saw a plane over there kind of just, go off the radar. Or maybe we don't even have radar yet. But whatever. There was the plane. And boy, oh boy, it's a relief to be back down on the ground with friendly companions. Isn't it like Tim Schwartz, my co-host? How are you tonight, Tim?
I'm doing great.
Did you survive that dog fight there?
Yeah, after listening to that, it makes me want to start singing that old Snoopy song, from when I was a kid. You probably don't remember that. You're not old enough, Tim.
Well, I'm older than you are. I believe, but I probably don't remember, to be honest with you. I'm a hardcore rock and roller, which actually is kind of the subject or one of the subjects about this show. Now, Tim, we usually have on two guests, right? I mean, because we like to do a little banter back and forth, and it's like sitting in our living room, exchanging notes and petting the dog and drinking a little beer and passing the popcorn and whatever else you like to pass, And, usually the guests are somehow kind of meshed together. I mean, there's a compatibility among the two of them. But this week I said, well, I got two great guests, but I don't know exactly how to link them up. And then I thought about it for a while, and I said, well, here's the obvious. Mac Malone, who is our guest this evening. Is it Malone or Maloney?
Maloney.
Maloney? Yeah. Okay, Maloney. Okay, Mac Maloney, of course, has written quite a bit on UFO sightings during the various global conflicts, including at World War II, where a lot of the airplane pilots were besieged by what became known as the Foo Fighters. Okay, they were seen mainly in, I think, the Pacific, but also in the European theater, and they followed the aircraft of the Allied forces and maybe some of the Axis planes as well. And some of them, I understand, even got inside the plane. And it's a mystery. I mean, nobody knows exactly what these orbs were. And there are different theories, of course. Some people think that they were extraterrestrial craft, some sort of monitoring device, but we don't know for sure. Anyway, Mac, I thought, well, that's an interesting subject. We're going to cover all the global conflicts on the Foo Fighters, but how does this tie in with our other guest, Peter? And then I thought, well, Peter has written a book on witchcraft, the occult, and rock and roll. So what is there a connection there? Well, the connection would be, of course, the band, the Foo Fighters, who obviously must have gotten their name from the phenomena, the objects, that the pilots saw and were chased by. But then, Tim, you told me later on in the day, you sent me an email, and you said that Mac had a even stronger connection with the rock and roll, that he was actually involved in doing promotion and publicity for some of the famous bands. And it turns out I know some of these guys, of course, including Robert Fripp, who was the lead guitar player for King Crimson. He did, and I've written this up on the internet, he did a spoken word record with my friend, the late White Witch of New York, Wally Elmlark. They went to England, and Robert Fripp and David Bowie helped with this album and put it together, but it's never been released, and I guess it's kind of just been lost in the shuffle. Now, for a while there, I knew Robert fairly well. We even went to a wedding together, and we kind of socialized. I couldn't say that he's a close friend, but there's a photo of me and him on the internet where we're holding hands. Nothing romantic. It was a photograph that was taken on the rooftop of Wally Elmlark during a UFO skywatch. She lived off of Central Park, and there had been quite a number of UFO sightings over Manhattan. I guess this would have been in the early to mid 1970s. And it turns out Robert Fripp was interested in the subject, as were a lot of rock and rollers. In fact, on the QT, Robert told me this story about how he was near Stonehenge one evening with one of his girlfriends in the back of the van doing the hot and nasty, and he happened to glance out. I don't know whether the door was open for air or whether they saw it through the the glass window, but there went an orange object, some sort of globe, right over the monuments of Stonehenge, somewhere near Stonehenge. And Robert had an interest in the subject, otherwise he wouldn't have been on the Skywatch holding hands with me. And of course, like I say, he was interested in witchcraft and my friend Wally and all, and I've written that up on the internet. So we have a much a closer connection and a closer tie here between these two guests than we actually thought. Again, it's one of my things. It's a synchronicity, more than just a coincidence. It's a hot synchronicity. So we're going to have a good time. We're going to rock and roll all over the place, and we're going to try to stay out of the Red Baron's path. So, Tim, why don't you tell us a little bit about our guests this evening?
Oh, I'm still liking that word, hot synchronicity. We could use that somewhere along the lines.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah, that just has a nice, flow
Ring
to
to
it.
it, yeah.
Hot synchronicity, yeah. Well, it's a real pleasure tonight because we have, as you said, we have Mac Maloney and Peter Biebergall. I know I'd mess that up. So Mac is the author of a number of fiction books, including my favorite, The Wingman, Chopper Ops, Starhawk, and Private Hunters, as well as the nonfiction UFOs in Wartime, What They Didn't Want You to Know, and his most recent one, Beyond Area 51. And Peter is the author of Season of the Witch, How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll, Too Much to Dream, A Psychedelic American Boyhood, and The Faith Between Us, A Jew and a Catholic Church for the Meaning of God. All of those excellent books, by the way. So, Mac, Peter, we are just thrilled to death to have you with us tonight.
We are on an expedition to find out all we can about the subjects at hand. Peter, I want to talk to you first. How did you get? Okay, now we know a lot of rock and roll musicians are interested in the occult. Jimmy Page, of course, lived in the house there with right across from Loch Ness, and in fact, the Rick Moraz from, of course, who played with Yes for a while. He even came to one of our UFO conferences in Phoenix and gave a performance, and then stayed up all night in the lobby of the hotel singing at the piano bar till about 2 a.m. So we've met a lot of rock and rollers. I've written about David Bowie and Mark Bolan and all these other famous musicians, and they all seem to share an interest in UFOs. Are you a musician yourself, Peter?
No, not at all.
No,
I
no.
tried to play the clarinet in my mid-30s, but we had a son and it was keeping him awake, so I had to put that aside. That was my one attempt at trying to be a musician.
Well, I tried with the violin when I was in school, and you and I can play together and start our own band.
That'd be great.
And I think we would sound, I hate to say this, a little bit better than Emerson, Lake and Palmer, but everybody to their own accord. All we have to do is pump up the volume a little. I would guess. So anyway, how did were you a writer first and then interested in music, or how did this all come about?
Oh, no, I mean, I grew up, in the mid to late 70s, early 80s, and I was completely enamored with my older siblings' record collection. And I was, it's funny that you mentioned Snoopy versus the Red Baron. That was my first record. I had a 45 of that I used to play, on the Fisher
Yes.
Price record player over and over and over again. But my brother was listening to David Bowie and the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and Alice Cooper, and I was completely. And I was, eventually I matured a little bit and listened to the Bay City Rollers.
Wow.
I kind of evolved, but there was something more interesting and a little bit darker and more mysterious going on in my brother's room. And so when he wasn't around, I would sneak in and listen to his records and freak myself out. But I was also. Oh no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, your brother showed you something interesting on that. What was it, Led Zeppelin album?
Yep, the little missive on Led Zeppelin 3, where the engineer at the time, Terry Manning, had carved on the master disc on the inner groove the Crowley quote, "Do what thou wilt." And there was it emphasized to me, or at least it revealed to me at the time, what I believed was an entire secret esoteric world in which these rock musicians inhabited. My brother also told me about that Paul of the Beatles was actually dead, and we went over all the records, and he showed me all the clues, and he played all the songs backwards where we could hear "I Buried Paul," and it was fascinating and scary and intriguing. And I ended up, but I was also, I was a fan of horror movies, and I played Dungeons and Dragons. I was always immersed sort of in the arcana of the 70s and the early 80s, and I went to school, studied religion and theology, and eventually found a way to put those two interests together in this book.
And so okay, you've written about witchcraft and the occult and rock music. Do you see witchcraft and the occult as being all of the devil, or what's your approach to the subject?
Oh no, definitely not.
No, okay,
yeah. I mean, I think. Well, I'll say a couple of things. I think that certainly the darker elements of the occult are attractive to musicians who want to either feel as though they're kind of pushing up against mainstream values. I think there's also a cynical way of looking at it, which is, it's a very good marketing in some ways. I think also you have to remember that a lot of these musicians at the time, when we think about Led Zeppelin, were, young working class gents who found themselves suddenly very rich with access to girls and drugs and any weird thing that they were interested in. And I think that elevated for them a sense of, again, of being on the edge of things, of being able to play with ideas and symbols that were considered to be dangerous. And that is a good thing when you yourself as an artist feel that the art that you're putting out there is potentially dangerous, is going to challenge mainstream conservative values.
Well, how far back does the rock and roll and the occult go? I mean, we know Howling Wolf. That was, of course, one example of the occult. He came out of a coffin, all dressed up, and so forth. Was there anybody before him that did it as a stage presentation?
Well, there's all the rumors, of course, in the early blues musicians like, Robert Johnson and Selling Salt, the Crossroads, and that's sort of the myth, right, of rock and roll sort of connection with the devil. But I think that you really don't see that to start really generating an idea that would really possess, and I don't use that word as a pun, to possess teenagers and even their parents being afraid of it, like in the 1960s, especially with psychedelic drugs and the impact that had on people's interest in alternative religions. And of course, it was the beginning of a new paganism in in the world and United States and in England. And so, all these things sort of came together. You had people trying to become sexually, politically liberated. They were also looking for spiritual liberation. They didn't
yes.
want the new religion to just be their parents' Christianity. They wanted something that was different. And so they sought out these ideas, and that atmosphere was captured in the music of the time.
Yeah. Well, now I was very much immersed in the rock and roll culture for quite a number of years. I wrote for all the magazines. I promoted a couple of local bands like the Harlots of 42nd Street, the Magic Tramps. Arthur Kane from the New York Dolls was a good friend of mine. He used to come to our UFO conferences. In fact, his wife, Barbara Kane, I still communicate with her on the internet. And the first band that I can think of that I actually went backstage to hang out was Black Sabbath. I was passing by the Fillmore East, which was the big concert venue in New York. And they were they were, I guess, I don't know whether they were on stage or the opening band was on stage, but I hesitated to hear the music because I'd always liked music. I mean, I'd seen Jimi Hendrix in a club, Chubby Checker, no connection between the two of them, but and my first album was Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis and all. So I stopped and I hesitated, and lo and behold, this biker was standing security there, and we got to chat, something you don't often do with a biker. And after a little conversation, he says to me, "You want to go in backstage?" And I said, sounds damn good to me. And so I went backstage, and I don't think I ever came out for 25 years. I mean, that's how much it really got into my system. In fact, I'm actually on the album Frankenstein. If you know the song by Edgar Winter. It's a total musical.
Fantastic.
Yes,
Yep.
yes. All right. Well, there's a song on the album called "We All Had a Really Good Time." Well, the record company, I believe it was Columbia, put a bunch of us in the recording studio with a couple of bottles of booze and some instruments like tambourines and all, and got us drunk. And if you listen to that song, "We All Had a Really Good Time," you'll hear me clinking an ashtray with a key in the background. They added all the sounds of the people partying on that
Wonderful.
on that song. So yeah, it's a rock and roll. And Mac, I was surprised to learn that you actually have a musical connection. Which came first, the music or the interest in military activity?
The interest in the military came first. My father was a veteran of World War II, and he had a lot of military history books around the house when I was growing up. And I used to sit there and look at the pictures until I was old enough to read, and then I read them. So I've always, as a young child, from the age of a young child on, I've always had some kind of interest in the military. My older brother was in the Air Force for 26 years. He used to fly out to Area 51. He was based at Nellis Air Force Base for a long time near Vegas, and he would occasionally be brought up to Area 51 to work on jets that were for some reason not working up there. But I've always been interested in rock and roll. The Beatles were it for me, and that really started me listening to rock music, almost full time right up until the present moment, to tell you the truth. So I got to say the military interest came first, but shortly after that, I really got into music.
Mm-hmm. So how many books have you written now?
I've written 55 books.
Oh, wow. Well, that's that's a goodly number. You're catching up with Tim and I because we and Brad Steiger, of course, and a few, Nick Redford and everything. Now, what are the subjects are not all military, are they?
Yeah, most of them are. Yeah,
they are.
There's a series that I do called Wingman, as you had mentioned in the opening, and I've been doing that for a long time. And the 18th book in the series is coming out May 2nd of next year. And all of them just about are military related, except for There was a couple books I did very early on Alfred Hitchcock and also on the Perry Mason show. But other than that, they've all they all have some kind of a military connection.
Well, when did you realize that, hey, UFOs might be somehow connected with the military battles and so forth?
Well, I grew up reading as many UFO-related books as I could get my hands on. And for some reason, there's always, in my mind, there's always a connection between the military and UFOs. And the more I read, like Donald Keyhole's books, for instance, from the 50s and so on, it just seemed like I kept coming upon stories about UFOs being spotted in times of, in times of war, the Foo Fighters in World War II is the most, is an example most people, would point to. But actually UFOs have been showing up, all throughout history. And there's a lot of evidence that they've showed up, in times of great conflict way back when, and then certainly in the 20th century, starting right before World War I, there's this connection that always seems to be there. That when there are great battles going on, UFOs seem to be always lurking in the background.
Well, didn't the in some of the literature about the Roman battles, they talk of these as flying shields?
Right. Alexander the Great was, on one of his campaigns, one of the people who would follow his army, scribes, they called them, wrote down that they were crossing a river into what is now close to India. And all of a sudden, these flying shields came out of the sky and started spooking the horses that they were using and prevented them from crossing the river. And that's how the scribe described these UFOs as flying shields.
Now, is that the first military conflict with UFOs that you're aware of?
That's the first one that we wrote about, extensively in UFOs in wartime. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, now let's move it up a notch closer to recent history. We have a book. Tim and I have a book called "Prophecies of the Presidents," and in there we talk about George Washington's vision of an angel and the prophecies that were given to him. Well, some people have interpreted the angel perhaps as an extraterrestrial. I mean, you could decide for yourself. Do you believe that that's a real story? Can you give us a brief synopsis of it?
Well, we have a story in UFOs in Wartime in which when they were at Valley Forge, the Continental Army was at Valley Forge in a very...
here we come with that the dreaded commercial, but that keeps us in business. So we'll be back in just a few minutes with our two guests for the evening. A very fascinating topic. Two topics: UFOs in war, during war, and UFOs and the occult and rock and roll. Yeah, my favorite.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Here we are back, approaching the holiday season, Tim. People will soon be out finishing up their holiday shopping and putting the turkey into the oven and inviting me over or sending the food special delivery. And
sending you your mac and cheese.
Well, I love my mac and cheese, and I wish I were feeling a little better, but what can you do? It's all in the eyes of the beholder, I suppose. But before the commercial break, we were talking to Mac Maloney, and he had just started telling us about George Washington and an experience that the father of our country had. You want to continue with that?
Sure. It was one of the stories that we uncovered for UFOs in wartime where there was a Native American tribe, people that they assumed were Native Americans, were encamped nearby Valley Forge, and they helped out the Continental Army. They gave them shoes, they gave them firewood, they gave them food and things of this nature. But and it's very kind of sketchy evidence, let's say, about this, but they did say several people there did say that they lived in a spherical building, and that sometimes was there, sometimes wasn't. So people have kind of made those connections to that this might have been a flying saucer that was landing nearby, helping out the Continental troops. As one of the stories is about 80 different small stories in UFOs in wartime, different examples that in the 20th century between people seeing UFOs, either during battles or leading up to battles. This story was just too good for us not to put in.
Yeah, I don't think I've run across that one before. Have you, Tim? Yeah, I don't think so. I think we've lost Tim. Well, Mac, you made a reference.
No. I'm not lost. I'm here.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just trying to say, I don't think I've run across that one before. I mean, and you would think that Washington and his troops would have maybe thought it kind of strange that here these Native Americans were in some kind of high tech object, obviously.
Well, once again, we we had so many stories to pick and choose from to put in the book, but you do have kind of a word limit, page limit. So there was a handful of them in there that seemed a little out there, but once again, they were just too interesting not to put in, and that was one of them.
Now, you made a reference to the UFOs during the First World War. Now, would this have been part of the one of the great airship flaps?
Well, there was a number of instances like that during World War I and leading up to World War I. In fact, in 1911, the Great Britain, the British Isles, the summer of 1911, I should say, were plagued by sightings of enormous airships that people at first thought were Zeppelins, but at the time, the Zeppelin had just been invented, and they were still kind of test flying them off of tethers in Germany. None of them could ever make it back and forth to Great Britain, yet hundreds of thousands of people saw these airships. They called them the scare ships. And at one point, they were actually tracked to see how fast they were going, and one report had them going about 250 miles an hour. Now, even a modern-day blimp can't even go more than 50 miles an hour. But these things were seen all over the British Isles. In fact, mystery airships were seen all over the world during that time.
There are actually some photographs that I think we even published one in our disclosure book of some long cylindrical, silver-shaped, cigar-shaped craft over island of Wales, maybe somewhere in England, in England, around that period of time. Now, also too, during the Spanish-American War, weren't there quite a number of cases where people, even cattle and all, were being abducted?
That we didn't do anything on. It's funny because in our research, we did not come upon anything in the Spanish-American War. Lots of UFO sightings, things along those lines. In 1917, though, there was the famous sighting at Fatima in Portugal, close by, that 50,000 people saw.
Oh, yes.
Something dancing in the sky.
Oh, yes.
At the beginning of World War I over London in 1914, a pilot who was kind of on air defense duty over London, basically up at altitude looking for Zeppelins. Now Zeppelins were operational, looking for Zeppelins coming towards London so they could, let out an air raid warning. He came upon something that looked like a flying boxcar or a passenger car, a railroad passenger train. Cigar-shaped object, lots of windows in it. He could see light coming from the windows. One of the best UFO sightings of World War I. Really very strange.
Well, what would you say was the sighting where there were the most multiple witnesses? Would that be the one?
Wow. During wartime, that's hard to say because a lot of these, for instance, Foo Fighter sightings over Europe, especially, there are instances where the RAF is bombing, German cities in the middle of the night. Some of them were 1,000 plane raids. They literally have 1,000 bombers up there at night dropping bombs in Germany, and there were reports of Foo Fighters riding right along their wing through these bombing raids, through these battles, and that to me is very strange. That might be, or actually, to tell you the truth, there were Foo Fighter sightings in the South Pacific where crews of a half a dozen ships at a time would see UFOs circling their ships and so on. So it's hard to pinpoint exactly which Foo Fighter or UFO sighting during World War II had the most witnesses, because there were a lot of people on the ground at the time, a lot of people in the air at the time, in times of conflict. So really, the number of people who saw any one particular UFO sighting is kind of hard to determine.
How about during the Civil War? Anything pop up in the history books?
Yeah, we really tried to get something in about the Civil War, and no, it's funny. It's the funny thing is that the absence of any kind of UFO activity during the Civil War it's almost trying to tell us something. I'm not sure quite what, but we couldn't find any reports of UFOs being spotted during the Civil War.
That is interesting. Considering that, I guess that there were at least several inventors who approached the United States military at around that time with claims that they had invented aircraft that would be that could be used during the war, and but nothing really ever came about it, or at least officially came about it.
Well, they had observation balloons, and that they would use for artillery spotters and reconnaissance and things like that. But they were all tethered, or most of them were tethered, and that's really about as far as it went.
I find it interesting that some of the best recorded UFO sightings have been done by the military over the years. Yet it's always the military that just always vehemently denies that there is anything to the UFO mystery.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's our U.S. our military. Certainly, that's been their position since the late 40s. Not so much, overseas. There are some countries, militaries like the British military. A few years ago, released all of their UFO documents. France is really kind of open-minded when it comes to UFO sightings. Brazil, also very open-minded. But, the way I look at it is, I think that the U.S. military knows more about UFOs than we do, we being, just ordinary civilians that say, I don't think the U.S. military knows what they are. I don't think the U.S. military has, any crash saucers or anything along those lines. But they certainly have more evidence that these things exist. I just don't believe that they know any more about where they come from than we do. I think it's just as big a mystery to them as it is to us.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. And they just they can't come forward and say, yeah, we know that our airspace is being violated all the time by these unknown aircraft, and we can't do anything about it. Boy, talk about throwing the credibility right out the window.
Right, exactly.
Well, Peter, since we're talking about UFOs here, I mean, have there been any UFO related things going on with some of these rock groups that you were talking about?
I'm not sure I know what you mean in that regard. In the
well,
way that you're
okay,
discussing it,
like David Bodie and the Spiders from Mars. And,
well, of course, yeah. I mean, that imagery became very important, especially at the end of the '60s, which sort of was a failure in some ways spiritually for people. I think they started to look towards a cosmic salvation, as it were. And so you even see, like you're all familiar with, how in the '70s pop culture, UFOs and aliens became extremely popular. And David Bowie, of course, would star in the movie The Man Who Fell to Earth. And I think you see a number of bands were starting to play with more sort of outer space, spiritual, cosmic consciousness, as opposed to sort of an Eastern mysticism, which was sort of what was propelling a lot of the 1960s spirituality. I think it was also around that time that you were starting to see. I think a lot of musicians were interested, at least in it, in a symbolic way, that the alien could potentially be a spiritual, messianic, had spiritual messianic potential.
Mm-hmm. Well, you had talked earlier about, especially like in the early '60s when rock was really, just starting to take off, and you heard a lot of this. Oh, it's this devil music, and I just wonder how many groups just kind of took that and they were like, "Hey, that's a great hook. Let's run with that."
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them, and I think also they were, perfectly interested in those things as well. I mean, I know that, some of the members of Black Sabbath loved horror movies and loved reading about these things, whether or not they actually believed that they were true or practiced any kind of magic. I don't sure we have any evidence of that, but certainly, when it came to how you are able to create a relationship with your audience and, you're able to Ozzy Osbourne could go up on stage and create these almost a new persona when he's up on stage is something I think that is a very old way in which we used to communicate with each other in terms of having a spiritual transmission where theater and performance were the way in which we activated sort of that part of our consciousness. And I think that somebody like, say, Ozzy Osbourne, who was very well attuned to how his music and his stage performances could actually, in some ways, change the consciousness of his audience. And now, when he comes off stage, everybody says, "Oh my God, you're the devil," and he says, "What are you talking about, the devil? That was just a fun thing we were doing while we were up there." But
Well,
in the moment that
Alice
he's
Cooper,
doing it, it feels real.
Alice Cooper, of course, was the son of a minister. And I knew him fairly well in the old days. But, mentioning Black Sabbath, Geezer Butler, who was, I think, the bass player in Black Sabbath for a long time, he was more into the UFO thing than anybody else. I remember I had a conversation with him backstage one time. He claimed that a UFO came over wherever he was living. I don't know whether it was in the U.S. or the UK at the time, and tried to pull tiles off the roof of his home. And somebody else in Ozzy's band had a tattoo of an alien on his forearm. I can't remember offhand who that was. And of course, I guess the best known musician with the occult connection would be Jimmy Page, who lived in the house there right next to Loch Ness, and was involved in the rituals and in his songs and tarot cards and the occult and witchcraft and stuff along that line.
The house had burned down not too long ago.
Well, I believe it did, yes.
That was Aleister Crowley had owned that for a while and tried to perform some rituals there, and that was what was particularly interested in him. But the truth of the matter is we don't have any evidence that Page, for all his interest in this, actually ever performed a ritual or attempted to summon an otherworldly entity. We know that he loved Crowley's particular philosophy, which is sort of a libertine sensibility and a sense of, your will activated in the world can actually change the world. And I think he saw what the music of Led Zeppelin was doing was that. Now, what did he practice magic? We don't know. He's never admitted to that, and nobody's ever come forward.
I think there are a few brief quotes to the effect that he had to perform some sort of rituals. We'd have to ask Kenneth Anger, who of course was living there for quite some time.
It was working. Yeah.
Now, I had a weird experience with Kenneth Anger, who not a lot of people have met, of course. But he was kind of this underground filmmaker, and he had gotten Jimmy Page to do a soundtrack for what was it, Lucifer Rising.
Mm-hmm.
And then the tape disappeared, or maybe Jimmy Page took the tape back, or God knows what happened to the tape. But actually, I saw on the internet the other day somebody had actually released an album supposedly of the tape. But I was having a UFO conference in Palm Springs to celebrate like the 50th anniversary of the contactee movement, and we had a very, very nice hotel. We got it for nothing because it was the middle of July, and you can imagine not much going on in Palm Springs when the temperature reaches 105. Okay, so we're setting up the vendor's booth. It's probably early on Friday, and a few people are coming in and wandering around. And I put some books out on the table, get them out of my boxes and all. And I see that somebody has left a stack of mail on the table, obviously, and wandering by to look at the books. They had left the envelopes there. They obviously had just come back from the post office. So I look at the envelope, and the envelopes are addressed to Kenneth Anger. So here's this somewhat elderly gentleman walking down the hallway past the exhibits and looking around and so forth. So I followed him down, the row, and I said, "Excuse me, I think you left your mail there. You must have picked up your mail and you left it on the when you stopped to look at some of the books." And I said, "By the way, are you Kenneth Anger, the filmmaker?" And he said, "Oh, yes, I am." Anyway, so he proceeded to tell me about a UFO sighting he had. He was living at the time in the home of the famous musician, and I can't think of the guy's name offhand. And he was up early one morning out on his bicycle, riding around Palm Springs, and he looked out, and lo and behold, there was this UFO of some sort that was following him for a brief period of time. So I said, "Well, are you coming to the conference?" And he said, "Well, I'd like to, but I'm really short on funds." I said, "Well, I'd like to invite you as my guest." And I seated him next to Robert Weiss, who was the director of the day that the Earth stood still. So I got to introduce both of them, the underground filmmaker and, of course, the famous filmmaker. That was something that I kind of enjoyed doing. But he had seen a UFO. I didn't really get to talk to him at any length about a page or anything else. I was too busy, to be honest with you. So what can you do? But there is a lot of musicians that have. In fact, the band ELO, which Mac, I believe you've done some work with.
No, not ELO. I've done a lot of work with bands, individual members of Yes, Moody Blues,
Yes.
King
right.
Crimson.
Oh, yes, King Crimson, of course, yes. But anyway, the Moody Blues, I know, had some UFO sightings where they even were in a studio in England, and they were trying to get make some space contacts, and supposedly some ethereal being or some invisible being appeared in the studio and left some fingerprints on the on the glass of the studio partition.
Well, that might have been their publicist in a more creative moment, let's say.
Well, it's in several books. I mean, I don't know. It's just it has been. They were interested in the subject because my friend Jim Delatoso, I knew him rather well. Jim being a student of the phenomena and also somebody who did a lot of the creative end of the rock and roll. In fact, I mentioned ELO because Jim had what remained of the UFO that ELO had used, their flying saucer that hung over the stage. It was in his backyard for a long time. Very deflated, to say the least, but it was there nonetheless. Yeah.
The people, the rock stars that I had talked to who were really into UFOs, number one, John Anderson of Yes is very deeply into it, and he gets a lot of fan mail in which people tell him instances where they've met extraterrestrials or seen UFOs. Paul Kantner, who was someone that we knew before he passed away, he was really into UFOs. He had grown up, like as I did, as a young kid, reading a lot of science fiction, a lot of Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein and stuff. Matt Maley of Counting Crows, the bass player, he's a very spiritual guy. He is also, we've talked a lot about UFOs, he and I, off the air. And my friend Patrick Moraz, who we mentioned at the beginning of the show.
Oh, yeah.
We actually set up I was doing publicity for him for a while. We set him up with a interview when he had a new album out. This is going back about 15 years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And he was going to be on a show in Philadelphia, but it was actually, the station was actually in New Jersey in the Pine Barrens, which is a very kind of spooky place. And on his way there with his wife, they had a UFO sighting. He called me the next day and said, not only was I not only did you get me on the show, but you also made me see a UFO before we went on the show. So
I know
he's very much into it.
He had good friends with Fred Bell, the late Fred Bell. They had worked together, I think, on some project, an album or something that I don't think ever got done because Fred passed away, and then I think Patrick had moved for a while. He was no longer playing with Yes, and went out on his own. I don't. Is he still recording?
Hey, Tim, let me interrupt for just a second here. Before we go our break, unfortunately, Peter is going to have to leave us for the rest of the show, and I want to give Peter just a quick chance to let our audience know where they could find him. Where find his books, where online presence, that sort of thing.
Sure, you can find me on Twitter, Peter Biebergall, one word, or you can go probably local bookstore online. You might be able to find my books.
And the title again is
Season of the Witch: How the Occult Saved Rock and Roll.
Well,
thank you, Peter. Really appreciate you being with us.
And
thanks
we'll have to do this again. And we'll be right back. We have a little bit longer break, but we'll be back in just a few minutes. And we'll be talking about UFOs and wartime experiences.
Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
And here we are back in our second hour of Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz with Tim Beckley, and right now we are talking with Mac Maloney. And Mac, I would be remiss if I did not bring up your Wingman series of books. I mean, I'm a big fan, and I'm really happy to see that you're going to be putting out a new one. When's that going to be coming out?
Well, thanks. It's coming out May 2nd, and we've I did 16 books in about 10 years back in between the mid 80s and mid 90s, and then I went on to do other things. But these days for writers, what's good about it is that if you get your copyrights back, which is usually 7 years after the book is off the bookshelves, then you can kind of go anywhere you want to have them redone as ebooks. And so we signed a deal with another publisher, and now all those old books 1 through 16 are selling very well again. So that's why they kind of compelled me to write a new one, and that'll be out May 2nd.
Well, now, how did you come up with the idea to begin with for the Wingman? And I was reading, and I think it was you that made the comment that they're kind of like, what was it, like a Mad Max in the air, and I love that. It goes, yeah, you're right. That's great. But how did you come up with the idea to begin with?
It was as simple as that, because I had written a couple books, as I mentioned before, on the one on the Alfred Hitchcock TV show, one on Perry Mason, and my agent said, well, can you send me some more ideas so we can, get something else going? Because when you're not writing a book, you're always trying to get another book deal, So I I wrote him a letter, and I had a whole bunch of ideas. I mean, it was everything that you can imagine, and including a Flintstones book, if you can believe it. And then the last paragraph, the last sentence, I said, well, how about Mad Max in an airplane? And at the time, Mad Max was like really hot, and Top Gun had just come out. So it was a perfect storm of those two kind of genres colliding, and that's what happened.
Well, I mean, I was always impressed, and I have to admit, Mac, for a while I figured that, and I know that Mac Maloney is a pen name, but I figured that there was like a whole slew of writers, cranking these out, and I was always impressed that the editors managed to keep the style and the tone consistent through the entire book. So then later when I found out that there was this one guy doing it, it's like even more impressed.
Well,
Because like I said, you really had to crank those out.
Yeah, at one point when the first year that we were doing them, which was 1987, it's amazing that it was that long ago. I was working full time for General Electric as one of their flacks, one of their PR guys, for their corporate headquarters, but I always wanted to write books, so I would get up at 4 a.m, write a few chapters, go to work in my suit, coat, and tie, come home, and write until like about midnight, and I did that for almost a year and a half, and that was like the first 4 books of the series, and thank God they were popular and successful, and I really haven't stopped since. So I've been really very lucky when it comes to a writing career.
Well, how did the subject of the Foo Fighters come up? How did you first tap into that?
Well, I was out to lunch with my editor from Berkeley Books one day, and we were just like tossing around ideas, and I just happened to mention to him, the subject of UFOs came up, and I happened to mention to him just something that had been on my mind for a long time. And I said to him, it seems like UFOs show up a lot during wartime, in times of war. And he just said, that would be an interesting book. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, yeah. He says, but it'd be a nonfiction book. I said, oh, no, it'll be a good break. Well, I'm glad I did it, but it's about 5 times more work to do a nonfiction book than a fiction book, because you have to, vet all the research, and it's written in a different way. And I remember halfway through it, looking around my office, and I just have like stacks of books and research and papers all over the place. And I thought, what have I done? What have I got myself into here? But it turned out to be successful. It's still selling. A lot of people like it. It got me really interested in, in part of the UFO community. We have our own radio show, and so a lot of stuff has come from it,
Well, now, how would you describe a Foo Fighter for those who are not familiar with the topic that much?
Mm-hmm. Well, it really started in the European theater of World War II, right early on when British bombers were bombing Germany in the the early 1940s, and pilots and crew would come back, and during their debriefings, they'd say, oh, by the way, we saw this, glowing red light off of our wing while this was going on, or we were trailed by something, or whatever. And the RAF, being how they were, said, oh, immediately, they're German superweapons, please tell us everything about it. But then every time they would come in, a crewman would come in with a story, it would be stamped top secret, and not many people got to see it. When the U.S. Army Air Force arrived in 1943 over in Britain, and now we started sending our bombers up there, and crewmen started seeing the same thing, the Americans thought, well, what else could these things be but German, wonder weapons or secret weapons? But they didn't have the time or the resources or the inclination to look into them because, they had a war to win. Winning the war, destroying Germany was their number one priority. And, they just figured, well, when the war is over, we'll find out exactly what these German secret weapons are. And then when the war was over, and, let's say they met across the table and they said, so tell us about these secret weapons. And the Germans literally said back to them, we thought they were your secret weapons. So the Germans saw them too. The Japanese saw them as well. Just UFOs showing up, in times of battle. Never any hostile action against any of our planes or anything. They're just there observing is what it really comes down to.
Now, they didn't really, how large were the objects? They didn't really have any structure is such like, later on in the late 40s and the 50s where people were seeing metallic craft.
Right.
Some of these were more like I was going to say in the classification, or even though they weren't, of like ball lightning and
Right.
spook lights.
Well, that's kind of a misconception because a lot of those kinds of unidentified flying objects were seen, basically like balls of light, but all throughout, when people started really looking into this, they found out that saucer-shaped craft were also spotted at the time. Cigar-shaped craft, which is really the most prevalent UFO, reported, is the cigar-shaped object. Lots of them, lots of things that look like. Other than a better description would be like Flash Gordon type rocket ships and so on. They saw a variety of different shapes and sizes. The ones that we, came to know, let's say, as flying saucers were included.
Now, what is your gut feeling as far as these objects? Are they extraterrestrial? Were they some secret weapon? Were they a combination of both? Nazi time travelers, or what do you make out of this?
Well, not Nazi time travelers. That's another thing that we really kind of put that myth to bed, that the Nazis had these super duper weapons and that they were talking to people on other planets in the 30s and they had a moon base down in Antarctica and so on. None of that is true. And the reason is that all you have to do is look at the Me-262 jet fighter, which was the first jet fighter ever operational. The Germans had it, and they had it for about a year and a half. Had they had it for longer than that, then the course of the war probably would have been changed. But if you look into an Me-262, the cockpit is made out of plywood. And the reason that is that the Germans were so short on key materials by that time that they couldn't make the jet cockpit out of anything other than plywood. And how could these people have a base on the moon if they can't even put, steel in their cockpit of their jet fighter? And then after World War II, when we went through everything the Germans had, there was never any evidence of any kind of factories, underground bases, any kind of support system for anything close to any of these secret weapons that people, claimed that they had. So we try to put that whole thing to bed. To answer your question, my opinion is that these are time travelers coming back from our own future to see history being made. It's if you look at it that way, that to me is the explanation that makes the most sense.
It really does. I agree with that completely. And can you imagine though the Allied pilots when they first saw that German jet fighter? They must have thought that they were seeing a UFO of some kind.
Mm-hmm. Well, we knew they were coming because they actually could have been operational about a year and a half before that. But Hitler, in his kind of perverse way of looking at, his own war machine, he did not want these jet fighters to be defensive in character, which of course they are. You want jet fighters to shoot down bombers, therefore they're a defensive weapon. He ordered them to be an offensive weapon and for them to carry bombs, which they did for a while, but it was negating any kind of, advantage that you had over propeller-driven aircraft. So once they became fighters, they were dangerous, but it was just too late in the war to really have a big effect.
Hey, we've got a question from one of our listeners, Ryan from Texas, and he wants to know, what is the difference between a Foo Fighter and what people call a modern day orb? And I'm not sure, but he may be referring to, like these digital pictures where, people will,
there are a lot of people actually, though, that are seeing not only taking the digital pictures, that some of which could be, of course, specks on the glass, but people. There's a lady who actually has a show at KCOR who has made a study of these, and they do seem to come in various sizes, and most of them are round and globe shape, but they do seem to be under intelligent control. So even if after you eliminate those that may be specks on the lens, there does seem to be a body of evidence that somebody's actually seeing something that are described as orbs. Now, whether this is the same as the Foo Fighters or not, I don't really know, of course. But
well, he just wrote back and he said he's talking about the lights or orbs in the sky. So do you think there's any difference? I mean, it may be just decades difference is all.
Well, they're very similar. A lot of what we would call orbs, or balls of light, were seen during World War II. We have a story in the book about how one followed a B-17 night raiding bomber all the way back from its target in Austria all the way back to its base in Italy, which would really, lend you to think that, this thing was under intelligent control. A lot of people thought that the balls of light were actually some way of spotting anti-aircraft fire or whatever, but for one of them to follow this airplane back, for its 3-hour trip back to its base in Italy, which showed that, it had to be something much, much more than that. And then again, lots of people saw cigar-shaped objects, saucer-shaped objects, just all the different kinds of UFO shapes and sizes that we see today, people saw during World War II.
How about the reported cases where these things actually penetrated the side of the aircraft?
We never got into any of that. The closest that we got to something like that was a report of a Canadian aircrew flying an RAF bomber coming back from a raid on Essen, Germany. And they had, allegedly pictures, but also everyone in the crew saw these orbs kind of very, very close enough so that you could see their brightness being reflected on the window and the fuselage of the airplane. But the orbs actually coming into the airplane and so on, that might have been, once again, someone's imagination.
Well, I think I've read of some reports. Of course, I didn't investigate them. Did you ever meet anybody who had a personal sighting?
A friend of mine who was in the Battle of the Bulge said one day that something went over their head, and it was fast, it was quick, and they couldn't quite see it. And he said that was either, an ME-262, which they had kind of an obscene nickname for, or, something that we don't know what it was.
Well, now we had we have a fellow who's on the show from time to time. He's one of our regulars by the name of Rick Hilberg. He's out of Cleveland, Ohio, and he publishes a newsletter that's been in existence for 40 years called Flying Saucer Digest. Mm-hmm. And one of the original publishers or editors of the magazine was a fellow by the name of Al Manick, who has since passed away. And I know I've talked to Al quite a few times. He was in, maybe it was the Korean conflict, and had a sighting of something that he thought was under intelligent control. I kind of think he thinks that they were of extraterrestrial origin. How many? Okay, so we've covered World War II. We know that there have been a heck of a lot. What would you say? 500-600 reports? Is there any actual number of sightings?
Hundreds. And the interesting thing about it is that the Army, released any documents they had about the RAF did too, kind of. But the U.S. Navy has never released any documents about what happened in the South Pacific having to do with Foo Fighters.
Oh. Well, how about ghost rockets?
Ghost rockets is something very, once again, very strange. 1946 over Sweden. People saw, this time, thousands of people would see rockets going overhead. Some of them were flying in formation. Some of them were alone. People at first thought that they were V-1 rockets that the Soviets might have taken over from after the war in Germany, and that there was some reason shooting them over Sweden. But number one, there were no more facilities after the war to launch V-1s. Number two, the Russians just didn't have the manpower or the logistics to do something like this. And number three, a Swedish pilot actually flew alongside one of these things, and his description, it matches almost exactly the description of a modern-day cruise missile. So the ghost rockets of 1946, a very, very strange story. The ghost flyers of 1933, same part of the world. People saw these very strange airplanes flying around for about a year. No one ever figured out what they were.
Yeah. Do you know anything about Mussolini had an interest in UFOs, and there's even some documents that's purported to show diagrams of UFOs that were seen over Italy while he was in power?
Mm-hmm. Once again, we didn't get into that in the book. I think we came upon things like that while we were doing the research, but we had kind of a word count that you had to stick to. I will say, too, that the Korean War is very important when it comes to UFOs and UFOs in wartime, because for the first time now, we have radar on the ground picking these things up. But by that time, almost all of the warplanes that we had on our site had radar aboard the plane itself. So it was a way to kind of verify what you were seeing. So if the radar on the ground sees a UFO and the radar in an airplane nearby sees it, they confirm each other, if you know what I mean. And now all of a sudden, instead of having UFO reports, just visual UFO reports, now you have electronic proof that something was up there.
Any difference between the Foo Fighters of World War II and the objects seen during the Korean conflict?
Just the same type, more flying saucer type objects were spotted, huge numbers, and also very large objects. And they were always buzzing our fleet off of in the Sea of Japan. Lots of sightings during the war. There was an incident where actually some U.S. soldiers fired at a UFO, and the UFO fired back at them. One of the very, very few instances of UFOs taking hostile action. In fact, they call that a close encounter of the fourth kind. Is when you make communication with the UFO and the UFO communicates back. In this case, firing some kind of a ray or something. But the strange thing about the Korean War was that about a year before, the Air Force issued its report saying that UFOs were completely fake, and that anyone who saw them were either delusional or they had some kind of religious motive. And then, only about 2 years later, now our jet fighter pilots are seeing these things over Korea, and the Air Force is backed into a corner because they can't say, what are they going to say, that their pilots are all religious nuts or, hallucinating or something? So that was really the thing that kind of pushed forward the idea that we have to start some kind of a study group on this, and that's how Project Blue Book came about.
I'm not I'm not all that read on the Korean conflict. Actually, where were the majority of the sightings made?
Over North Korea during Allied bombing raids, certainly, and but also above the battles. I mean, there was a famous movie made of the Korean War called The Pork Chop Hill, which was a great movie with Gregory Peck on it. It really shows you how kind of needless the Korean War was as far as just massive loss of life on each side for no reason, whether at the peace tables and so on. There were UFO sightings over the Battle of Pork Chop Hill while it was going on. It's just very strange. It's strange that during the Korean War it was a shorter conflict, less people involved, but more and more detailed UFO sightings, especially by military people.
Well, now there's a fellow who wrote a book, Gods of Eden. I think his name is Bromley.
Bramley, I think is what
Bramley,
it is.
yes, okay. Yeah. And he talks about how even going back to I think the Black Plague, how there were UFOs involved in a lot of this. He sees a very kind of negative and hostile attitude that the UFOs are keeping tabs on our military like activities. Do you see? Of course, you have all these sightings today around missile silos and all. Do you see any plan of operation?
Well, that's a tough question to answer, like in the minute we have until the break. There's certainly lots and lots of reports of UFOs, literally hanging around and buzzing our ICBM bases in the late 60s and the early 70s. Definitely some kind of coordinated plan, because there were several nights where they would buzz atomic stockpiles up in Maine and then as far west as Colorado, all on the same night, 3 or 4 places right across the country. Once again, the military, anytime you see any kind of report on it, they always say that they were unknown helicopters. That's what they called them. But, there was something more than that, certainly.
Tim,
most of them don't even look like helicopters.
Yeah, that's the thing, Tim. I mean, especially during the Vietnam War was the reports of mysterious helicopters, which then seemed to move over to the United States. Especially in the 1990s with all the reports of the black helicopters being associated with UFOs. So I just it makes me wonder sometimes, because there have been some witnesses who have seen UFOs almost morph into helicopters or even like conventional jet planes. Like they're able to disguise themselves. So just
any radio contact?
Well, we'll have to ask Mac when we come back
like
from our break. Yeah, because here we are at the bottom of the hour. So stay tuned for more Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Well, I think the Red Baron has been defeated, because I don't see him up here in the sky, but I sure do see a lot of weird lights, and they seem to be closing in. So I think I'm going to be headed back to base in just a very short while. And we've had a very interesting program here this evening, Tim. I don't think we've ever actually talked about Foo Fighters or UFOs during the global conflicts. And Mac Maloney, who's our guest, who's an author, has written books on the subject and has his own radio show. What is the name of your show, Mac?
It's Mac Maloney's Military X-Files show.
Mm-hmm. And you have a guest on there, or you...
Yep, we have two co-hosts, and then we bring in guest authors and so on. And then we have regular correspondents who call in for every show, war correspondents, and also people who are kind of historians of UFO sightings and so on.
Oh. And do you ever have people call in that were in the military who have been involved with the Foo Fighters?
Well, no, we tape the show, but we do two regular guests on our show. One of them works for, I know a lot of people say this, but one of them works for the three-letter agencies, let's say. And then one of our co-hosts is someone who did classified operations. He's a pilot, did classified operations during the Iraq War, and now works for a company that contracts out to the three-letter agency. So, we have a lot of, real people on the show, people who actually work for the government and so on. So that makes it an interesting show in that regard.
Very good, yes. And how long have you been doing the program?
In some way, shape, or form, about 4 years now.
Oh, my goodness. Well, you've covered a lot of ground. Well, I did want to bring up of course, one of my favorite military cases is Rendlesham Forest, or Bentwaters. We've had, of course, Peter Robbins on the show a couple of times. He's co-authored the book with Larry Warren, East of Leftgate, or whatever it's called.
Left at Eastgate.
Yes, indeed. Yes, I should know it by this time. But anyway, Larry, I was saying during the break that I first met Larry on the steps of the Brewster High School in Brewster, New York. This would have been, he thinks it was 1983. There had been the UFO sightings all over Westchester County, and people were seeing like boomerang-shaped objects, and they were coming down fairly, close, and they were silent and huge. Mm-hmm. And I guess the News of the World, the British newspaper, had just maybe broken the story about the incident at Bentwaters, where several dozen U.S. military security guards had seen an object come down and land outside the main gate of the base in Bentwoods Forest. Now, so Larry I don't think had ever told his story publicly, but he got up on the stairs of the Brewster High School, and I think Betty Hill was there, and I was there, and maybe a dozen people or so. And for the first time publicly, as far as I know, he told of his experience at Bentwaters. And Mac, I said to myself, this guy is either an incredible storyteller, a liar, or this is the most incredible, well-documented military type experience of all time. And I would say, from what I've learned, that I I would say that it can't be surpassed as far as the number of witnesses, the stability of the witnesses, even if they all don't remember exactly the same events. Some of them are a little hazy. There may have been some mind control or Manchurian candidate type of things going on there. What do you make of the events there in Rendlesham Forest?
Well, you're right. It's one of the most heavily documented and most witnessed sightings. There's actually two sightings on two separate occasions right after Christmas in the early '80s, and these two places, Rendlesham and Bentwaters, were two air bases that they shouldn't have had, but they did have nuclear weapons stored there, and the fact that the colonel actually went into the forest with the tape recorder.
Yes, Colonel Halt. Yes,
Colonel Halt, and you can hear him describing what's going on. I mean, and to listen to it, it's fascinating and chilling at the same time. It just amazing some of the stuff. What he saw, what the other people saw. If you really look into what went on in those 3 or 4 days, it's really very unusual, and a lot of people too. Maybe not realize that next to these two air bases that had these nuclear weapons, covertly stored there, not even a half mile away, right out on the coast, was an NSA listening station. There was a lot of kind of black ops stuff going on around there at the time, it's a fascinating story, it's like one of these stories you can't get enough of. And Peter Rums is a good friend of mine, and I know he's done a lot of research on it. So my hat's off to him.
Well, in fact, there is another witness who just came forward within the last week or so. I say came forward. It seems to me that I might have actually heard him talk about his experiences before, but he was out there, I guess, on the third night. There's 3 nights in question, or at least one of them is in question more than the other one, actually. But something certainly did go on there over a period of 3 nights, and it was quite spectacular. The skeptics tried to say, "Oh, it was the beam from the lighthouse," but that's total nonsense. First of all, the security guards who were involved in this, they had seen the beacon from the lighthouse many, many times, and they interviewed the lighthouse keeper, and he flat outly said it could not have been the beam from the lighthouse, because on the side of the lighthouse that the light would go into the forest, there is a big metal plate, so there's no reflection into the forest of the light to begin with. It's not the lighthouse, and I don't think it's the light of a police cruiser that is supposed to have been driving through the area at the time. Of course, now Jim Penningston and John Burroughs have had their own experiences, and of course they've been doing the radio talk show circuit now for quite a while. And Jim, I believe he thinks that they're time travelers, and he even has some sort of binary code, which I don't quite understand. But supposedly there's a notebook full of zeros and ones or something to that effect.
Well, when you have an incident like this, and this is just my opinion, but I think a number of people share it, is that as time goes on, a lot of noise kind of creeps up around the real event, and I think, in my opinion, I think that actually prevents us from getting to the truth of, what happened in a case like Rendlesham Bentwaters. This is what we know. The first night that the guards at the gate saw this light in the woods, they thought an airplane had crashed. Okay, they were at an airbase. They thought an airplane had crashed. That's how big an event this was, as far as, lights and lights coming through the forest and so on and so forth. And then, when they get closer to it, they said it looked like a huge Christmas tree. Okay, so now this isn't a light from a lighthouse. This isn't a light from reflecting off of, the sky, and all this stuff. This is really something that's going on here. And I always like to just go to what happened the first nights. What did the first witnesses see? And I'm more inclined to believe them than someone who's written a book 20 years later. Now, listen, I love those books. They're entertaining and so on. Some of them do put forth different theories and so but really, I go back to what Colonel Halt said in his recorder. I mean, because he's as close to an eyewitness we've ever had for anything like this. And he was a colonel, and he said later on, I'm the type of guy who actually tries to damp down these stories, not to bring them to the fore. But he did, So that's time travelers and underground bases, aliens, and so on. I'm less inclined to believe that. I'm just inclined that, like everyone else, these people in the woods saw something is there, but we have no idea what it was. It's unexplainable.
Well, what is why the massive cover up?
Well, I think that because, as we were talking about earlier on, is that the Defense Department, especially the U.S. Defense Department, it spends just hundreds of billions of dollars every year, and basically, the bottom line is that they're doing that to keep us safe. If there's something flying around up there that they don't know what it is, then they're not doing their job, and they will never admit that. So they just kind of sweep it under the rug. They have not seen any instances. Certainly not in open source, information of UFOs harming anybody or shooting anybody or killing anybody. I mean, there are isolated incidents where aircraft have crashed after chasing UFOs, but they're not blowing planes out of the sky or anything. So it's like, well, they don't pose a threat to the United States. It's how they used to say it in the 50s. But again, I think they know more about it. I think there's more evidence that they exist, but they're not going to give that to us because, once again, it proves that they're not doing their job.
You brought up an interesting point about the nuclear weapons being stored there at the base. There's been a long history of UFO activity and nukes. I mean, both in the United States and Soviet Union. I mean, look at the Roswell crash, whatever that was. We won't go into that, but I mean, the Roswell base was the only base in the United States that had the atomic fighter group.
Mm-hmm. It was at the time of the Roswell incident, the bomb group down there was the only Air Force bomb group that was equipped with nuclear weapons, for sure. But see, and this might be a topic for another show, but I don't believe anything went on down in Roswell, and I think people are missing the main story of Roswell. And what it is that there was a ICBM base that was being built down there in Roswell years later after the supposed incident. And so many UFOs showed up over this ICBM base under construction that the Air Force version of the MPs would not go out and guard it at night. They wrote to the Pentagon and said, we can't do this. This is just too scary, too creepy. We see these things all the time. We don't want to do it. They're actually disobeying orders. That's how weird it was. And they would send jet fighters over it almost every night. And, once again, what would happen is people would see the UFOs. The jet fighters would show up. The UFOs would disappear. The jet fighters would have to return to base for fuel. The UFOs would come back. It was the same old story. Many, many more things, credible things, documented things happened at that ICBM base in Roswell than this Roswell incident will ever have. And that's why I think people are missing something strange happened in Roswell. It wasn't this whole thing finding the pieces of what was probably an intelligence balloon. Just go right down the street to the ICBM base and look into what happened there. And it's much more compelling and frankly frightening than anything that happened in Roswell.
Yet you don't hear anything about these massive UFO sightings over this ICBM base as being constructed.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of information did come out, and Peter Jennings, who, was an ABC newsman for many years, he did a show about 3 or 4 years before he died. It was a 3-hour show on ABC about UFOs. It's the most concise and the most well put together document you'll ever see. TV on a major network, let's say.
Mm-hmm. I remember that show.
Yeah, he really, really gets into it, and he talks to crew members of B-52s who saw like UFOs like on landing approaches and stuff, and fighter pilots, and talks to scientists, and it talks a lot about UFOs over these ICBM bases, and no one has any kind of a explanation for these things. These are our ICBM bases, and they should be the most secure part of our arsenal, and yet UFOs were flying over them and shutting off the power, and screwing around with the timing systems and stuff. It's a fascinating story that the military has managed to kind of keep under the radar.
Yeah. Well, Major Donald T. Kehoe, of course, wrote some of the early books on flying saucers, UFOs from outer space, and so forth. And of course, whenever he tried to get some congressional hearings or some information out to the public, the subject was always deep six. Do you think we'll ever see a time when, like there'll be some public disclosure?
Not from the United States government, no. Though our new president, if anyone was going to do it, he would do it, but only because I feel like he's someone who's going in there with this anti-establishment view. In my opinion, not the best one, but if he's going to break down some walls and so on, if presidents are briefed on UFO activity, like supposedly they are, then he was probably going to be the first person to make it public.
Well, he doesn't even listen to his intelligence reports, so I don't know about that. But I don't know. I don't know as if the presidents are privy to that much information on the subject. Maybe a few of them seem to know more about it than others, like Ronald Reagan. Of course, made a number of
UFO
statements. Yeah, UFO statements, and of course, Gerald Ford, because his constituents, were seeing UFOs and got on his case. I think that's the only way that we're ever going to get UFO disclosure is if there's a massive flap and a million people either march on Washington or send in an email or something to that effect. They don't listen to 10,000 emails. That's a drop in the bucket. I mean that doesn't even scrape their across their palm to take an interest in anything like that.
Well, I'll tell you, that maybe is going to happen in the future, but it's not going to happen in the United States. It's going to happen in China, or it's going to happen in India. That's where I believe, and it's sad to say this, but that's where the scientific investigation into UFOs, that's where it will begin. It won't begin in the United States. It will begin someplace in either China or India, because those are people that will look into these things and won't have this automatically from the start, let's cover it up,
Well, many years ago, I was kind of involved with an incident that took place at the UN where Sir Eric Gary from one of the islands in the Caribbean tried to get the world body to set up some sort of UFO investigative group, and I guess he had UFO sightings, and Dr. Hynek appeared and spoke at the UN, and Jacques Vallée and Colonel Coyne, who was the helicopter pilot who encountered over Ohio the UFO that circled his helicopter.
Right.
And, every single nation on the face of the earth, except for Grenada and India, voted against it. I mean, you can't get like all these countries to agree on anything at the United Nations. But boy, when it came to UFOs, they agreed in mass and just put a kibosh on the whole subject. It was deader than a doornail in a couple of hours.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's just the way it goes because the United States is top dog, But I just think that the Chinese government have a different view of it. I think that they have a genuine curiosity about it, which tells you that they don't know much about it either. There's some very, very strange UFO sightings in China. Things like UFOs incredibly bright, picked up on video, hanging around their major airports for a long time. Just very strange stuff going on in China, and I think that they might not have it in the paper every day, but I think that there's a good chance that the Chinese government, some part of the Chinese military, is looking into these things.
Oh yeah, well there was an incident just a couple of years ago where they had to shut down the Hangzhou airport because of a UFO hanging just right overhead. Planes couldn't go in or out.
Right. See, everyone always thinks, I mean, certainly during the after World War II, when Stalin was still in power, and he gave an order saying that any Russian pilot who sees a UFO, shoot it down immediately, fire on it immediately. Well, he's saying that because he believes that these are U.S., secret airplanes or secret spy planes or whatever the people are calling UFOs. He's fallen into the same trap. Oh, they must be my enemy's secret weapons, therefore shoot them down. Probably not a good idea, but I don't know. It's when you really take the whole thing, when you really kind of look at it, if the U.S. government knew the Russian government knew what UFOs were, okay, don't you think that it would have leaked out by now? I mean, I know about disclosure and everything, but these days, in the past 10 years, nothing can be made secret. Even the guys who shot the SEAL Team 6 guys who shot Bin Laden have written books, and they're supposed to be not speak to for threat of death, for God's sakes. Okay, well, don't you think UFO information would have leaked out by now?
You would think so. But anyway, we are closing in on the midnight hour here in New York. And so we only have a few minutes to go, and I want to give Mac the opportunity to tell us about his upcoming activities in a couple of minutes.
Wow. Well, we do the Mac Maloney Military X-Files show. It's a weekly show. You find it on Dark Matter Radio and a number of other networks. We're also on the Military Appreciation Channel and Armed Forces Radio Network. The Wingman books, the Wingman 18 will be out May 2nd. 2017. You can go to Amazon.com and just type in Mac Maloney. You can see all the books that I've done. And also, I'm in a band called Sky Club, and our second album is coming out, and it's all about UFOs and people I've met in the UFO community. Since I've been in it, and so that should be coming out in May as well.
Well, we look forward to by all means.
Thank you.
I'll even put my platform shoes back on.
All right,
and join you
with the dead goldfish floating.
And join you in my. Well, actually, in the old days, I was known as Mr. Glitter. I had glitter tops. I did a little bit of the, mascara under the eye and stuff.
Nice.
I mean, that was my my thing at the moment, and hanging out back stage. There isn't hardly a band that I didn't see, to be honest with you, and most of them I enjoyed. Anyway, we're coming up to the end of the show, and Tim, I want to thank. First of all, I want to wish everybody a happy holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a happy holiday to all of our guests from this year, and all of our listeners, and all of those who watch our YouTube shows on Mr. UFO Secret Files. I want to wish a happy holiday to Tina, our producer and engineer, to Carol and Helen and April and everybody who helps us with the show, and for those who order books. And I want to say good night to you, Tim, and Merry Christmas to your family.
Merry Christmas to you, Mac. Thank you very much. You're a great guest tonight.
Yes,
thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate it.
Up and out of here, and look out, Red Baron. Here I come.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.